most people here in the U.S. are not following the intricacies of Middle Eastern politics, but the majority of Americans side with Israel, according to Gallup. Why do you think that is? And you've explained this at length so far over the course of this conversation, but I'm curious if you have a capsule argument that Israeli policy violates human rights both in the occupied territories and within the state of Israel proper, that you would make to people who are less informed on the matter or on the fence.
Well, first I'd say, the it's shifting. The numbers are shifting, and they're shifting fairly quickly. And we sort of end the book with some hope and optimism, which is, rare for people who study Middle East policy, to say, hey, things are moving in the right direction. You could look at it both in terms of public opinion polls, or you could look at it in terms of in real life politics. When you look at someone like Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders, who weren't as far on this issue as I wanted them to be, but were light years, and Bernie in particular, light years ahead of all the other candidates. To be a major presidential contender, and to be able to have a position on human rights, or to say that, Netanyahu's not always right, a low bar, but high on this issue, to be able to say, funding should be withheld based on the treatment of Palestinians in Gaza, that's major. And the fact that they did not win the presidency, but it had nothing to do with those stances, is something extraordinary. What does it say? I think it says that things are moving in the right direction. But to your point, the reason why it's been so difficult to move the needle is because saying that I stand with Israel is like kissing a baby. It is the easiest political stance to take. It's the least controversial stance to take. I remember watching Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton in 2016, and you couldn't tell who you couldn't tell if I wrote down their comments, particularly after the second debate. You couldn't tell who was who. Hillary gave all the AIPAC talking points. They could have chosen Paradise. They chose Hamas. Literally point for point, all the talking points. Donald Trump actually, in his first speech, was like, I'm going to stay in the middle and not be a decider here and let them work it out. I'll just negotiate. By the second one, he had the talking points, right? And he was like everybody else. He started bragging about being, in the parades in New York. I mean, he took it to the Trumpian level. But my point is, there's a way that the average American voter has not been given access to a different argument. What we've seen since Operation Protective Edge in 2014, that Gaza war, and I remember I was still working for a cable news network then, when you saw the bodies, when you saw evidence of disproportionate force, when you heard the stories, a lot of Americans were moved by that. When we were on the streets of Ferguson getting tear gassed, and we were getting messages from the West Bank, about how to wash tear gas out of our eyes and how to protect ourselves, it helped sway public sentiment. All this stuff mattered. But if people are still not swayed, and I think they are getting swayed by that, I will now answer your actual question. I think the basic for me, and I don't have a singular argument, because I do think that the West Bank, Gaza, and inside of Israel are three very distinct sets of challenges. Although I think the fundamental thing, and this is what I said at the United Nations, is that if we just appeal to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, we see in all three areas a contradiction between what nation states at post-World War II are supposed to do and be, and what they are. Not just in Israel and the United States and around the world, but on this question of Israel, absolutely. And so that would be the kind of big picture thing. But in Gaza, I'm saying they're in an open air prison. There is. Right. It was predicted that Gaza will be uninhabitable by 2020.
2020, yeah.
The predictions were correct. It's 2021.
What's the stat about drinking water? That like 95% is not potable.
It's not potable. Yeah. I mean, this is where we are. When I talk about 40 inside of Israel, what some say inside of 48. It's much. I think that is much more. Often when I talk to Black folk, and and we do delegations and things like that around the country, you see people going on. I look on the internet, I see people doing delegations, and they often say the Palestinian condition is like Black folk in America. And I'm like, in some ways yes, in some ways no. Being stateless is different, right? Being in Gaza is different. Being enslaved is different. All these contexts are different. But one interesting comparison for me is that the Palestinian inside of Israel, the Palestinian who has citizenship, in many ways is a second-class citizen. It's much more like an American apartheid situation, right? It's much more like a South African apartheid situation. Not saying that the conditions are exactly the same, right? Not saying that Israel is just like apartheid South Africa, but that it satisfies the conditions of apartheid to the extent that there are a differential set of experiences, laws, realities, and outcomes given to different people based on a racial or religious or ethnic or national identity. Inside the West Bank, to be stateless, to be bound in that way, I think I don't have a capsule argument, and I don't have necessarily a comparator as much as I talk about what it means to live under occupation, what it means to have to go through checkpoints, what it means to not have a state, to not belong to a state, what it means to be in limbo, what it means to suffer the ritual humiliation of a checkpoint, what it means to be an internally displaced refugee, what it means to be in a place like I don't know, like Tulkarem, for example, a refugee camp where they used to give you tents, but now they built concrete. People have been in refugee camps for 70 years. Like what does it mean to be this? And Mitchell, I'm sorry, I'm going on and on. Mitchell, please.
No, it's okay. I wanted to actually just boil it down. If we want to have a capsule argument, as you asked for, Virgil, I think it comes back to what I said before. It's a question of rights. How is it that we, sitting in the United States quite comfortably, relatively speaking to people living in Gaza and the West Bank, how is it that we tolerate and support through our government's actions and our tax dollars the complete denial of rights to millions of people? I mean, to me, it's that simple. When we talk about how do we resolve this conflict, it always starts with Israel's security. And I'm not, Israelis are entitled to live their lives without worrying about missiles and bombs and warfare and all the things that Israelis do worry about. I have been, I was in Sderot about 11 or so, 12 years ago, during a rocket attack. This is a town in southern Israel that is very near Gaza, and it frequently has rockets launched at it. I was there. I watched people with severe PTSD. I saw the effects of having literally missiles explode near you. So I understand that, not nearly as well as people who actually live it, but I get it. And I was also there for the retaliation, and I could hear, for hours, the Israeli artillery being fired into Gaza. The security is important. It's important for everyone, but it has to start with everyone's rights. If Palestinians have the same rights and responsibilities as Israelis, then we can move forward. If all these problems are still there, we have ways of dealing with it. But the way it is now, you have one side that is, for the most part, able to live their lives, albeit with some horrible disruptions. But people who live in Tel Aviv, people who live in Haifa, people who live in Jerusalem can basically live their lives. And you have other people who have no lives. It is deprived of them. They can't get to work every day. They can't get to school every day. They can't see their families. I mean, there's so many different stories for Palestinians. And just essentially speaking, they have no rights. They don't have civil rights. Then their human rights are not respected. So that has to be the starting place. If we as Americans have any sort of values whatsoever, it's that we don't tolerate that sort of state of affairs. So if we start from there, I think everything else becomes much easier to resolve.
Well, what it feels like to me in part is that if all you have access to is the mainstream narrative, where, to your point, Mark, saying, just a flat declaration of support of Israel is the easiest thing to do, like kissing a baby, then it starts to kind of affect your consciousness. Like, well, what's the alternative? Like, why would I argue for anything on the alternative? And in the absence of a more comprehensive understanding of how we got here, I think it's very easy just to default to the known narrative. So it might be worth just talking a little bit about historically how we got to this place where we have these, and I know that seems like very basic, but I think that kind of lack of accessibility is part of why we end up in these arguments. Why is it that Palestine is an open air prison? What are the conditions that were placed on import export that made the conditions there so bad? Why do we have a West Bank and a Gaza Strip? I think that's part of it.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a very long and complicated thing. And Mitchell and I have spent many years, Mitchell more than me, reading and studying and understanding this in very nuanced fashion, because some of the little quibbles are the things that are so high stakes in this conversation, right? I mean, Gaza to me is a very clear human rights crisis. It's indisputable. The Israeli government would say this is a problem that Palestinians created for themselves, that Jewish citizens left the Gaza Strip in 2005, that Palestinians had free elections and they could have elected whoever they wanted, and they chose Hamas. Now, and we talk about this in the 4th chapter of our book a little bit, about the choice of Hamas, particularly in relation to the other parties, right? Particularly Fatah. But that Israeli argument rests upon a false assumption that Palestinians have been able to engage in self-determination. That's why when Mitchell talks about rights, he's absolutely correct. But I think there's also the conversation about self-determination for Palestinians, right? Which is something that often doesn't get talked about enough. So Gaza is bordered by land, air, and sea by Israel. Mm-hmm. Israel still controls what goes in and out. The population registry, the aeromagnetic sphere, all of it is controlled by Israel. Palestinians have not had one day of actual autonomous rule in Gaza. So, and what's happening at the Egyptian border in Rafah isn't any better. I'm not ignoring the question of Egypt. It's just a different conversation than the one we're having right now. But I want to make that clear as well. So it's like, you can't talk about what happened in Gaza, which is why we spend so much time on Gaza in the book. It's our longest chapter, because you can't understand the crisis in Gaza, to your point, Bree, if you don't drill down on how we got there. You can't understand what's happening in the West Bank. Since 1967, it's been under Israeli occupation. From 48 to 67, it's under Jordanian occupation. These occupations matter. The context of these occupations matter. But we also can't begin the story of Palestine or Israel in 1948, because what that does, or even 1939, right? If we're thinking about the beginning of World War II, because what that does is it ignores the fact that the Zionist movement is one that precedes World War II. It precedes Hitler's rise to power. It precedes all of these things. And the reason why that's important is because, again, part of what Americans understand, part of the dominant narrative of Americans is that there was an ugly, vicious Holocaust. Our Jewish brothers and sisters were under threat and attack, and all that is true. The Holocaust was ugly. It's maybe the greatest atrocity in human history, and yet that's not where the Zionist movement begins. And so we have to understand what's happening in 1882. What's happening in 1897? I'm just picking dates of both the first major immigration, also the Herzl's kind of, Zionist, the formation of the Zionist organization, which would become the World Zionist Organization later. These are all things that help tell the story, right? When there's conflict, right? But okay, let me say one more thing. It's also important to understand that the Zionist movement is emerging out of the hell of Europe. And pogroms in Russia, pogroms in Poland. I mean, Jewish people were under attack, and there's never been a moment in human history where Jewish people have not been under attack, which is precisely why the desire to have a state of its own people, a Jewish state, felt so urgent. That's why they looked at other places, other countries. Historic Palestine wasn't the only place, although obviously because there's been a nonstop Jewish presence in historic Palestine and what at the time was Ottoman Palestine, that made sense. That made a whole lot of sense in their mind. But the question was, what happens to the people who are already there? And for Americans to fully understand what is called the conflict, they must understand what is happening to Palestinian people at this moment. They must understand the role of empire, right? First the British and then the United States in controlling this, because the British wanted what they call empire on the cheap. They wanted to be able to control strategically the Middle East without having to invest their own troops and their own people there. And what better to do than have people there? My sense, and many historians would agree with this, this is based on my reading of history, not like my hunch, is The British were largely indifferent to who controlled that region. They just wanted to control the region. That's what empires do. The empires go on empire, right? And there's a very particular way that led to a set of political outcomes and policy declarations that only enhance the conflict, whether it's the Balfour Declaration of 1917, whether it's the Hussein and McMahon correspondences. All of these things created a very complicated, messy arrangement in the Middle East that the British were largely indifferent to as long as they could control things. But you began to see clashes as Jewish immigration increased and the Yishuv began to expand, the Zionist community prior to 48 began to expand. You began to see more clashes, but the clashes weren't largely about them being Jewish. It was largely about immigration. It was largely about jobs. It was largely about land. And that's where you see these clashes. I'm not saying there was no anti-Semitism, but these were clashes over immigration for a people who were already there. And if the more people, and Mitchell, please jump in, the more people understand this history and these tensions and the role of the British and also the role of British and American anti-Semitism, because the British didn't want Jewish people in the UK. Americans didn't want Jewish people here. It was as much about controlling the Middle East as much as it was their own anti-Semitism, both in terms of not wanting Jewish people here and their own anti-Semitic conspiracy theories about Jewish power, as Tom Segev and others talk about in their work, that made them think that that we should side with them. So in many ways, anti-Semitism births some of the stuff we're talking about. Anyway, Mitchell, I'm sorry.
That's actually a really important point for me to pick up on, because, the earliest days of Zionism in the late 19th century, it grows out of the anti-Semitism in Europe. It grows out of the pogroms. It grows out of this sense of constant persecution. And the one of the flip sides of that is that the focus on Palestine also then brings in a European view of what was called back then the quote unquote Orient. And that was one of the things that fueled Zionist leaders. It also fueled British leaders who were working with them. Lord Balfour, who wrote the famous Balfour Declaration that said that basically stated the UK's support for a Jewish homeland, by the way, not a Jewish state, but a Jewish homeland in Palestine.
Key point.
That grew out of a desire, as Mark said, to get rid of Britain's Jews. That was part of a big part of the motivation. Another part was also the idea that this would be a sort of Western outpost in the Middle East, which at that time was becoming more and more important as the globe was becoming smaller, and of course oil and concerns like that would come up very soon. I think the key point to understand why so many Americans are sympathetic immediately to the Israeli side of this story, and frequently have a much colder heart toward the Palestinian side before necessarily getting into all the facts of the matter, is because of Jewish history, because Jewish history is something that they are very, very aware of. And on the other hand, a certain amount of racism against Arabs. So those two things have come together over a great many years, and it's heightened by the Holocaust. One thing I think it's important when people talk about how can Israelis do this, how can Jews do this, how can they support, how does that happen? One of the things that I think people really need to understand about the Jewish people now, whether Israeli or otherwise, is the Holocaust wasn't just a genocide. It wasn't just for us. It was not just this really, really horrible example of mass murder in a history that we have faced similar things. It was more than that, because for the first time ever in Jewish history, our pattern has always been, hatred rises against us. It gets too dangerous. We go somewhere else. In World War II, we had nowhere else to go. And that is scary. And people, and it convinced many, many Jews, I think, with some reason, that there has to be a state that we know we can go to no matter what, that under any circumstances, we know their doors will always be open to Jews fleeing persecution. And I think that's a big part of the reason that so many people, not only so many Jews hold on to Israel, but that so many non-Jews support that desire, because they recognize the same thing. Jews need somewhere that they know we can go. I have written about other solutions to this that I think could work, but it certainly is an understandable sort of impulse that grows out of not only the Holocaust. Europe has a lot of guilt about the Holocaust. I'm glad they do, quite frankly.
Yeah.
The United States also has a lot of guilt about the Holocaust, because the United States, with all of our able-bodied men off to war, right? That was like this big thing. So many of our younger men were overseas, and a lot of our skilled labor was overseas. And so Jews fleeing Europe thought, well, hey, the United States could really use our help right now. That's what they expected. Instead, they got, no, we don't want you people here. Go back to Germany. And that is what happened. They went back to Germany and they were killed. So I think the United States has some justifiable guilt about this too. And I'm fine with them feeling guilty. I am not fine with them trying to assuage that guilt on the backs of the Palestinians. And that's where I think part of a lot of this argument touches a nerve for people. That's why it gets so heated. Among other reasons. It's certainly not the only reason, but that is one reason that this argument and this debate, this political issue that should be dealt with in a more rational way, can't be dealt with in a more rational way, because it touches on a lot of that history.
Well, speaking of third rails, I do want to ask you about this point you alluded to earlier, which is this, I sincerely did not realize this was, I never heard of this before. Mark, your controversy arose about the phrase that came up earlier, between the river and the sea. Can you explain why that is such a charged phrase?
Well, I could explain to you. It's an interesting question. So when I called for a free Palestine from the river to the sea, I was referring to, as Mitchell said, a belief that we should have justice and equality in the entire region of historic Palestine. When I say historic Palestine, I'm referring to that entire area, both in the state of Israel, what is now known as the state of Israel, founded in 1948, also in the West Bank, and also in Gaza, what would have been, 70 years ago, 70, my math is off, 73 years ago, all called Palestine, or the British Mandate of Palestine. And before that, Ottoman Palestine. For me, that entire region requires a kind of justice. Now, sometimes when people talk about justice, they're only talking about the West Bank. They're only talking about ending the occupation. Some people are saying we got to do something about Gaza. Some people are saying, inside of Israel is just fine. Or some people are only focused on what's happening inside the state of Israel, right? My point was, in that entire region from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea, we need that. For me, the way to accomplish that, I'm not agnostic on the one state, two state question. I believe in a one state solution, both for practical reasons and philosophical reasons. However, I don't think it's up to me to decide. I think it's up to Israelis to decide. I think it's up to Palestinians to decide. And ultimately, whatever they work out that they feel is just and fair, I'm down with. I just want to see peace, and I'm going to stand in solidarity with whoever's on the side of justice. But the idea of a one state solution is also part of why I say from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. There were people after I gave the speech who, of course, said, well, no, this is a slogan from Hamas, right? The ruling party in Gaza, maybe soon the entire West Bank, who knows with these elections, right? And they believe that it was a call for Judenrein, a call for the elimination of Jews throughout the region. There are a couple things to that. One, I absolutely was not calling for any harm to come to any Jewish people. I do not believe in doing any harm to any Jewish people. I believe in a one-state solution, one person, one vote, a secular democracy, right? With provisions in place to ensure that Israel remains a safe haven for Jewish people, but also that makes sure that Palestinians can live in peace, freedom, self-determination, dignity, and with a right to return. And so for me, that's what I was talking about. Hamas was created in 1987, right? The idea, the river to the sea, is something that has been said long before 1987. It's been something that's been said by Palestinians. It's something that's been said by Jews. It's something that's been said throughout the region. The Likud party, the party of Mr. Benjamin Netanyahu, once used "River to the Sea" as their platform slogan. I saw a tweet from is it Yair? Is his name Yair? His son, is it Yair Netanyahu?
Yair Netanyahu.
Yair Netanyahu, that said that
real
we need
piece of work.
He's a real piece of work, who said that Israel should be free from the river to the sea. About 6 months after I gave my speech, no one accused him of calling for the elimination of Palestinians, when in fact there is a much stronger argument that his vision of the future would exclude Palestinians far more than any poll or interaction with Palestinians or vote or legitimate political possibility would suggest that Palestinians are calling to push Jewish people off the land. At this point, it's about a shared peace. It's about a shared reality, but it's also about relinquishing oneself of the right to rule. So when I give a speech that is 20 minutes long with a whole bunch of words in it, that is appealing to law and facts and data, and the only thing that gets picked apart are the last 8 words, right? And really the last 6, right? From the river to the sea. It's partly because I can't say how people felt about it. I'm not saying people were sincere or insincere, but what I can say is in the context of the speech that I gave and in the long and deep history of that phrase being used by people on the left and the right of Israel, by people who are Palestinian and Israeli in Israel, by people who were calling for all sorts of visions of Israel, I feel that in many ways it was disingenuous and a convenient and cynical play to say, oh, that's what Hamas says. And then everybody who doesn't know anything about this says, they read a headline and says, Marc Lamont Hill uses Hamas slogan. Oh, you know they be using, you know how people do, the Wikipedia experts, the Twitter experts who see some shit.
This seems like a trend that, like, so I'm trying to get to this theme, this pattern that seems to have emerged where there really does seem to be, you know, in the midst of all of the cancel culture wars that go on, kind of the unsung canceled,
right,
do seem to be people who are on the left who are often canceled for this particular issue, for making some critique of American foreign policy toward Israel.
Yeah, I think that's the third rail. I think that, and part of it is, let me be honest, I mean, part of it is that sometimes, particularly those who are not steeped in the context, can invoke language, slogans. I'll give you a good example. After Ferguson, people talked about police exchanges with Israel, right? Now, and it's true that their police departments in the United States are being trained in Israel, and some Israeli departments are training in the United States. Those are both facts. And when we look at certain habits and types of policing in the States, we do see some similarities. And when we look in Israel, we see some similarities, right? But what ends up happening was, as the narrative advanced in the States, it got flattened out and thinned out and twittered out. And before you know it, people were saying cops in Israel are training police to shoot black people. Some people were saying that, which is not true. And it ties into the blood libel, right? Which is this sort of long-standing cultural and anti-Semitic pattern of accusing and blaming Jews for the deaths of other people. You know, at one time it was about children, and there's a whole long history of what the blood libel means. But as a practical matter, it's accusing Jews of the kill. So now it's Israel or Jews taught black people, America, how to kill black people. America had been killing black people long before Israel was founded. Long before Herzl had an idea to move into Ottoman Palestine, black people were getting lynched, killed, raped, enslaved, etc.
You had Nazis studying American eugenicists and some tips.
Exactly. So we didn't need, so I would not blame Israel for for black people getting killed in the United States. That's unreasonable. And I wouldn't blame American cops for the death of Palestinians or black Israelis in Israel. But we can start there. But that doesn't mean we can't have a conversation, as we do in this book, about rising authoritarianism in both countries, that we can't have a conversation about the expansion of a security state, what it means for Palestinians, even citizens, to be seen as outside threats, and then to look at what happens when black folk march on the streets as opposed to white people at the Capitol, and how we get seen as outside threats who are met not as citizens who need protection, but as foreign threats who need to be contained. That is a similarity. We look at the weaponry and the exchange of weaponry, look at the types of warlike weapons that are slightly scaled down, as Mitchell's written about this, and I've written about it in my book, We Still Here. We look at weaponry, we look at exchanges, we look at tactics, we look at the security state where human rights and the deprivation of human rights are acceptable as long as it keeps us safe. That's a post 9/11 American mentality. Again, we ain't just get it from Israel. That's George Bushian as well. But the point is that there are similarities, and as this country moves further and further to the right, and as Israel moves further and further to the right, and up until November of last year, we had two leaders, a prime minister and a president, who were extraordinarily corrupt, anti-democratic, fascist, and committed to a set of values that don't reflect the best interests of all the citizens. When you have that, that resonates with these police exchanges. So walk the tightrope. Not because there's some conspiracy, but you walk the tightrope because we don't want to do harm. We walk the tightrope because it's the right thing to do. We walk the tightrope because we don't want to reinforce anti-Semitic tropes of Jewish power and cabals and all that stuff. We also, though, have to hold power accountable. Not Jewish power, American power. Not Jewish power, Israeli power, government power, state power. And if we do that, we can get the kind of freedom and the kind of outcomes we want. And that's what we're trying to do with Except for Palestine, the limits of progressive politics.